everyone. This is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. Today, I'm here to interview Layman Pascal. He's very much plugged into the integral theory community, conscious community online. He wrote a book that I recently read, In Between Worlds, and if you can just pronounce his name for me again.
Gorgeous
Gorgeous.
for a
Yeah.
time between worlds.
My name is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And I have over 14 years of collective experience as a registered social worker. So stay tuned as I cover a topic in this area.
Yeah, today we're going to focus on just narcissism is usually my focus on my channel. So those who've been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse, and particularly within the family dynamic, I wanted to talk about is just developmental theory and self-development and how that shows up in the individual, but also in the collective, but also maybe talk about perhaps where it can go wrong and where difficult personalities or what we consider narcissistic personalities can create challenges and cult dynamics in certain conscious communities. And imagine a lot of people listening to this, if they've had this in their family dynamic. Sometimes you like there's notion of the repetition compulsion, right? Of like with take Freud, where we tend to repeat that in our work life or romantic life, or even in communities. We join like a yoga community. This cult-like dynamic can occur. Anyway, we'll talk about different aspects of this, but Layman, I thought maybe if you could introduce yourself a little bit to the audience and we can go from there.
I'm Layman Pascal. I'm in Thunder Bay, Ontario, but I grew up on the West Coast. I'm an author and philosopher and a spiritual theorist and facilitator, specializing in certain kinds of postmodern non-duality work. That means a lot of time spent with the overlapping developmental, transformational, and regenerative communities, and there's a bunch of them. The integral diaspora, or the general scene around the integral developmental meta model and the communities that sprung up around that, they're one of the major players. That I spent a lot of time working with their models and their notions of how we make a healthy, sane, balanced, multidimensional human being that can secure themselves in a basic human way, but also continue to be available to ongoing, interesting mutations, development, and maturation that might go beyond the old fashioned idea of just normal adult waking state consciousness.
No, I see. And just to the like lay person watching this, like, how would you define the regenerative community and maybe also integral, just generally? Like, I think I've spoken one of my videos just about how child development occurs and how as adults we continue to develop and evolve. It sounds like what you're saying is that those people that are seeking development and interested in this field, usually I imagine will seek you out or be part of these communities that you're a part of. Would you say that's where you are in terms of this?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the way that Integral is laid out is that it assembles a number of core components that it doesn't want to forget, right? That there's growth and complexification dynamics, shadow work dynamics, different kinds of states of consciousness. There's different types of people, there's different lines of intelligence through which we could develop at different rates. So, in all of that, there's a lot of room for people to come in from different angles. Some of these communities are much more interested in sociological transformation and how that works with ecology, how we set up new external systems at a higher level of integrated complexity. Some people are much more interested in how we individually or in groups work out how to be more complex, more integrated, deeper, healthier, things like that. So integral is like it's one philosophy among several that attempts to assemble a big picture map of the basic components of reality that we don't want to leave out if we want to have a balanced and productive healing and ongoing growth and change.
I see. That makes sense. I imagine we're both interested, and I know that layman's not actually integral theory. And in Ken Wilber's work, he has a notion of growing up, waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. I think there's another one. Maybe I missed one.
He tweaks it a lot. There's three main ones, and then he's always adjusting the other ones a little bit as he goes. But you got the main ones.
Yeah. And with my work as a therapist, a social worker, I'm helping, I would say to some degree growing up, because in some of my work, what I talk about is just the notion that we have this adult part of ourselves, IFS therapy, internal family systems. You can consider it like a manager part, but then there's a notion where we have these child parts, or even if you grew up with a difficult childhood, this child part gets activated. Some of that in terms of growing up is helping that aspect, like in inner bonding therapy or parenting yourself. For my audience, we talk about psychology and the shadow and For a lot of my clients, I would say they're interested in that topic. There's a notion within a narcissistic family, the collective, it could be the parent or both parents or even the siblings, sometimes scapegoating a child and having that as like this collective shadow projected onto that person where they speak up about that shadow, they tend to get vilified or scapegoated even worse. And yeah, so for a lot of my audience, they're on the receiving end of scapegoating. And so that's the notion, right? To some degree, Carl Jung would talk about the shadow and that being projected onto that client. And so a lot of them have to deal with grief. There can be some identity issues. There can be low self-esteem. But I guess the point is also just the shadow too. That's good reminders that when you're on your journey in that dark night of the soul and you've been on the receiving end of this, and there's also your shadow, right? And maybe I don't know if you've specialized in this area too much, but there's this notion of righteous rage. You have a lot of anger usually with your parent or your family, but then if each time you lash out or get angry at the family dynamic, they tend to deflect and never really address it. And you also become seen as the crazy one or the one with issues. And so, anyway, I guess that's what I wanted to mention is that maybe we want to comment on any of that, I guess, is your focus on the waking up aspect, I would say, and also group dynamics. You do touch on cleaning up as well and shadow work. Is there anything you wanted to comment on that in terms of how you help people? I imagine you come across people dealing with family situations, difficulties in their relationships.
There's at the heart of all of this for me, and from an integrative perspective, which includes but is not limited to Ken Wilber's integral theory.
Yeah.
The notion is that a lot of our ongoing maturational growth comes from increased integration between different perspectives that we can take, right? That our psyche is modular to some degree. And that these modules, it's like a symphony. When the symphony plays well together, you got beautiful music. If you're always hearing the trombone, you got a problem. And that module stands out too much and has to be addressed somehow. The modules can be disrupted at each of these developmental fulcrums that someone goes through. Any parent knows that the personality and ability to see a world that a child has undergoes several major transformations. They gain new abilities, they track new things. So we have these shifts in how we understand ourselves, what we're capable of doing, and the world we're capable of perceiving. Each time we go through one of these shifts, and they can continue through adulthood, it's just less common. Each time we go through one of these reorganizations of the ego and our world space and how we comport ourselves, things can get blocked off, they can get left behind. We can go through these at different rates as well. One of the problems is some part of you from before gets left, gets malnourished, gets ignored and left behind. Another one is that at your new level, some part of you doesn't get recognized, nourished, and connected with others in an adequate way. So only parts of you move forward. Another problem is if you accelerate through these stages, if there are reasons out of your personal motivation or your circumstances that make you need to grow up faster, so to speak, then you might have to do it in a narrow way and not get a rich, full sense of what each of these layers in yourself are. So when you arrive at adulthood, you have these different sets of problems. All those layers are still in your system. They're all still functioning. You have the self from all those different levels. Some of those selves need to be recontacted and nourished again, reparented in certain ways. They need to figure out how to play well with each other. And so there's all these like remedial, maturational things to deal with the structures put in place by the levels we've already gone through. And then there's this open-ended question of what would it be like to become a deeper or more complex, more mature or more complete human being from where you are now. But I think a lot of the dynamics are the same in all these cases, which is an accepting and energizing, and then an and integrating structurally of different component parts in the way we make sense of the world, different subsystems of our sense-making process.
In terms of the shadow, how do you work with the shadow? I also talked about Robert Keegan too. It seems like what you were saying is you make the subject object. Just to take an example of probably a lot of people listening to this, they've been in this family dynamic and to the scapegoat, they think it's their fault throughout their life. And then they have some issues with their relationships or their work life, and they find themselves repeating this situation that maybe reminds them of their childhood. But then they start to, usually later in life, right? They start to look back and they realize that it started in their family of origin. And I don't think a lot of us necessarily want to blame our parents, but if you are really on the receiving end of someone who's characterly disturbed, it creates a certain level of neurosis within the individual and then mental health issues. And what was my point? I guess it's just you start to see it as an object, right? The family, and you start to see these patterns. And some of my work is just pointing out some of these patterns. But yeah, then there's these younger parts still that get triggered. And but like you're saying, it's parenting, the question there, but you obviously deal with the shadow sometimes. Is there anything further you'd want to say about the shadow, how this comes up
Sure.
first? Yeah.
One thing that stands out in integral discourse is the problem of making the wrong part of the subject into an object. Wilbur spent a lot of time with Fritz Perls and the humanist transpersonal Gestalt scene around Esalen back in the day. Fritz Perls had a really good take on retrojection, retroflexion, and the possibility that if you can't tolerate a quality in yourself, you might project that quality onto someone else and then experience the reciprocal quality. The classic example is you feel an impulse to attack, but it's not egosyntonic. You can't process that. You can't experience that as something that's your impulse. So you imagine an other, and often with justification, that other has that impulse, and you feel fear of attack. So then you go to a developmental or spiritual context, and people say, okay, sit down. We're going to be mindful of this. We're going to take your subjective contents and make them into objects and patterns you can inspect, and you're going to grow past them, and you're going to become a new and bigger subject that can examine those things. So you examine your fear and you grow past it and you make it into an object. But you weren't really feeling fear. You were actually feeling hostility that you retroactively inscripted into yourself as fear. So now, by gaining that experiential distance from your fear, what's happened to your hostility? So this was one of the things for Wilbur when he started to try to clarify the major components of his system. This is the reason why he had to have shadow work in there, because people will come in and go, kind of lifelong Buddhist. What do I need shadow work for? Can't I just meditate and that will solve it?
Yeah.
There are specific things meditation will not solve if the things you're meditating on and the self you're developing is blind to or has reversed its own qualities. You have to be able to undertake specific exercises to put yourself in touch with qualities that you might otherwise not want to be in touch with, and then work back with those to integrate them in a way that is acceptable to your ego structure. So that's one of the pieces, this range of shadow qualities. And we often think of shadow as being inherently dark, but it's disowned or non-integrated aspects of the self that then get projected onto other things. A lot of what comes up in developmental communities is this thing called the golden shadow, which is that you have insights and capacities and possibilities that are very positive, sometimes even miraculous seeming, but you imagine they're the property of someone else who's the screen onto which you project those. So I don't have golden heart radiance. My master has golden heart radiance. And that can be a good training system. It can be appropriate, but at some point you've got to be like, no, that quality actually belongs to me. I don't know if you saw Fight Club, but there's a scene at the end
Yeah.
where he has to talk himself into realizing that Brad Pitt's gun is actually, that gun is in my hand. I know it's there. I know it's actually mine. And I've got to cognitively walk myself into that position. Otherwise, I'm in the victim position relative to that potency.
That makes sense. And when you're talking, I was just thinking about within this go back to narcissism is for a person that's really not developed, there's a notion of splitting. They split the kids usually into a golden child and into the scapegoat, or there's different roles sometimes. But I guess I just wanted to pick up on that, just that they can be this projection of the shadow, but then you're the scapegoat, or maybe you're just a little more conscious. You grow up in these environments and you point it out to the parent, but they won't see it and actually double down. Anyway, if you're on your own journey, none of us are perfect. You can get angry at your parents and like really, let's say you're projecting onto them because I think there's ways in which they were abusive, I would say. But I guess what to say, you don't want to hold on to that anger, that resentment throughout your life. Yeah, so I guess I'm just talking about the journey from you just limiting or going no contact. So I talk about differentiation, right? So it's about having a solid self. And as if you're in a narcissistic family or an emotionally mature situation, you get enmeshed and there's a boring of self. And usually people get triggered and they regress to these younger parts. And but so shadow work is Also, usually it's that anger, that resentment. It's working with that energy because you have a lot of anger usually. But you were mentioning something too about Fritz Perls, and I guess you're talking about meditation versus psychology, right? And therapy, that's what you're doing, looking at these aspects of yourself that you don't always want to look at, or but there's also shadow work. I know there's the 3-2-1 process in Wilbur. I just wanted to clarify what you mean by meditation. Usually you're not having a relationship with aspects of yourself. At least that's the way I was taught. It's like someone begging on the corner trying to get your attention and you try to ignore them. Thoughts are still there, but you just choose not to have a relationship. But then in your life, if you're always doing that, then you're like, I'm not that person, or that's not like me. Then there's that risk, right? Where that you have this big shadow and you're not seeing it. So did that make sense? And I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
comment
yeah.
on
There's a
anything I
lot of
mentioned.
first of all, it's tricky because different types of people, especially coming from different cultural contexts, have different degrees they feel, say, problems with parents or family members need to be resolved with that person, or whether it can be let go and worked on within themselves, right? People have different sort of settings relative to that. And at a certain point, these people are gone. If your abusive parent dies, you have to, at that point, work on your relationship with them as something that is occurring within your system, right? Where they are figures or perspectives that you need to heal in yourself that isn't quite the same as that other person out there in the world changing themselves or admitting it or coming around to a realization. It's nice if that happens, but that can't be relied upon as the basic mechanism. Now, when it comes to meditation, I have a very broad definition. I would say any intentional modification of your attention for the purpose of self refinement or self transcendence is essentially meditation. There are certain people, right? Andrew Cohen's no relationship method is strict or strident. It has a very cutting kind of a quality. And there are a lot of spiritual traditions that do it that way. I think there's a risk there. You can also have a similar result from a process where you're welcoming and identifying with each thing. I think the active driver is the intentionalizing relationship with these qualities and building coherence rather than establishing an empty gap between you and that thing. There are different ways to frame spiritual practice. And the idea of trying to secure yourself as the disembodied witness that is separate from all of the arising phenomenon outside and inside, there are some dangers associated with that kind of framing, even though a lot of people find it successful. Another interesting thing for me is I spent some time training in a system of Buddhist meditation and psychology, and their approach was very critical of Western therapeutic methods. As far as they're concerned, the brain is a machine that gives you more of what you practice. So you should practice the states you want to be in and not practice the states you don't want to be in. And that's an interesting thing to consider when you think about shadow work and therapeutic regression and recontacting hurt parts of yourself. To what degree are you healing, and to what degree are you just practicing making those things that you are more fluent in experiencing and more likely to experience again in the future? For me, the thing that makes the difference between regression as a practice and regression as healing is whether or not the context is coherent. And I think if you have a lot of effective spiritual practice, you can hold a kind of field of coherence that allows you to go into those places and have them come out as an integrative move. Other times you don't have that, and another person, a therapeutic partner of some kind, can hold that space for you while you go into those conditions and explore them. But if you don't have some sort of field of coherence from which you can go into the identification and come back out, then it becomes really risky to go into those identifications. And under those conditions, it might be better sometimes just to ensure that your ego and your consciousness are capable of separating from those identities. But I think there's a richer and healthier and more humanly complex way to go at it, which is to establish coherence from which you can more fluidly enter into identities, integrate their energies, and come back out.
There's a lot to go into there. I guess you're saying that when I was thinking like you're talking about Buddhism psychology or just that philosophy, and I guess it's also like the brain, what fires together, wires together. So where's the line? I guess that's what you were saying, processing difficult memories of these parts of the self, but then like analysis paralysis. to a certain point, it doesn't help you in your journey, I guess is the question. For a lot of my clients who have been on this receiving end of this, is I'm sure you may have read the book, like Body Keeps a Score, and the notion of like somatic practice and work and how the nervous system can vary. If you're on the receiving end of a character disturbed individual, like if you're a family dynamic or a romantic relationship, and that's your constant exposure, if you're in that fight or flight or freeze or fawn. And then really, I think it's about building up your immune system and your nervous system to focus on getting more emotionally regulated. I think once you get solid in your body, processing some of these memories, and but then in it, like you said, in a therapeutic or in a container. I think you mentioned meditation too as being important for that. It depends on the person. Some people are more traumatized than others. Should you necessarily do meditation if that's the case? Maybe you can comment a little bit more on that.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of meditation, right? And I would think that meditations that build your capacity for intentional attention are universally useful in all of these processes. Meditations that involve you either dissociating from or remaining open to all the rising contents of your psyche, those depend upon what's in your psyche and how competent you are at holding that position in a responsible way. So that's just one example of some differences. I think there's a lot to the somatic piece, both in terms of having a body whose postures can occupy the experiences they're having. And that so some of that can be yogic asana training of can I really show up as a body externally and internally, because it's not just your external postures, it's also all of that Wilhelm Reich kind of stuff. Can I allow my organs to be stimulated enough for me to recontact these fragmented parts in myself? Can I allow the uncomfortable sensations of the electrical stimulation in my system that's necessary to help my nervous system reorganize around this? And this is something, again, where some forms of meditation are very useful. Do I have relatively stable access to what they call somatic interoception, right? Can I feel the spaciousness and sensation field of the inside of my body? How good am I at directly sensing what's going on in myself? That makes a change. It gives us some extra energy. It gives us wiggle room. It gives us an extra register with which to receive even strongly charged content when it arises in us. And that's something you can practice as certain kinds of meditation modalities.
It makes sense. And in your book, I've talked in some of my videos about the three brains, right? I was just thinking in therapy, sometimes you're analyzing these things. A lot of my clients will read a lot of books and go down a lot of these rabbit holes and learn a lot about the family dynamic and narcissism. I think it's very good. You have to have educational knowledge, but then they're not really healing in some sense because maybe it's one of their emotions, like not being fully in their heart, maybe, or processing some of these, the grief that they've been through. But then there's also the gut, and sometimes they can have nervous system issues, especially if they've been around the family and they keep going back in this repetition. It really affects their body usually and starts to break down. Yeah, a lot of people know that intuitively because your body's like your first boundary to the world, right? And if it's like you're in a system where it's being crossed emotionally, maybe psychologically, maybe you can speak a little more about that with the three brains and how it goes up in the book we wrote.
Sure. One of the major components of integral theory is this notion of lines, which is like different styles of intelligence, different talents. There's this whole discourse since Howard Gardner of multiple intelligences. We have different thematic capacities to harness our cognition. And those tend to be related to slightly different aspects of the nervous system. We feel them very directly, some more than others. In terms of where's my musical intelligence located, that's a bit vague. But when we think about thinking, we tend to think
Yeah,
about our head and seeing
yeah.
something. When we have an emotional thing, that very often does something in the chest. We have somebody hears that their child died. You see they clutch their belly. There are physical locations connected to specializations within the nervous system. There are more emotional and more cerebral and more proprioceptive and neuromuscular aspects of our neurological information system. These have a role in the kind of dysregulations that become pathologies that we might try to heal. They also have a role in our ongoing future development possibilities. So when it comes to the problematic aspect, it might be that one or more of these got injured or didn't get educated, didn't get nourished the way it needed to, or there might be a situation that you experienced with one of those systems that you try not to experience by making one of the other ones predominate. Very often, a person who's overly mental might be trying to avoid something physical or emotional. But likewise, a person who emotes really strongly all the time might be avoiding doing the work of thinking about what they need. So there's those kind of counterbalance dynamics. And then there's this possibility of future development that could come through exercises, very often meditational in nature, but not exclusively, that interweave those systems and cause them to cross pollinate each other to create more coordination and more meaningfulness. And this is what I take out of the Gurdjieff system. One of the things I take out of it is a way of thinking about ongoing development as a possibility of the integration or increased resonant coupling of these different systems, which can operate quasi independently in us most of the time without ourselves really noticing it.
I think sometimes what I see in my practice or just in my clients is like it's difficulty emotion, right? Or they'll describe what happened to them, but they don't always connect to the heart, or they overanalyze and they spin but obviously when there's also the notion like cognitive dissonance, right? Where intellectually you might know that there's something going on with your relationship or your family. You've seen it maybe many times, and there's no notion, right? When you see something, you can't unsee it. But then the heart, emotions, and gut, because it's obviously maybe it's like accepting that my family is flaws in it, or they don't love me, maybe, or some difficult truths, maybe. And you don't want to say it's hard for you to accept it emotionally. I also think about practices too. And sometimes I just think about with the heart meditation, just focusing on your heart. But like you said, when you go to your head, problem solving, you're comparing, you're taking perspectives. But with your heart, it's almost like a different kinds of experiencing, right? It's more subtle. There's not always, I don't know how to describe it always, but there's not always content to it, but it's immediate, right? Would you say? And then with your gut, I sometimes think of it like the subconscious and your dreams, your intuition. It's maybe your lower part of your development. Is there anything you want to pick up from what I said there, just in terms of practices, maybe? And yeah.
Yeah, one of the simplest things is to check these different systems, especially when there's a condition of extra stimulation, agitation, something's energizing us, right? We tend to grab from one of those systems and have it predominate. Whether you're doing it to yourself or facilitating someone else, it could be easily guided to check in on those other ones. Like what emotion goes with that, or what does your body want to do in regards to that, or that kind of thing. I think one of the very interesting approaches to psychology that I've always liked is Eugene Gendlin, or Gendlin, people say sometimes, the focusing method, where
Mm.
you're going to evoke a lot of the elements of a situation and get a general proprioceptive, like a body sense of what the issue is, and then experimentally try to language something until you feel it lock in and create a felt shift. What that is, you're trying to come up with something from the mental system that corresponds to what's going on in the somatic system. That's an example of experimentally trying to bring two or more systems together around the same content. And that can really open up energy and information. I mentioned people like Reich because sometimes it's just that our body is not letting itself get excited enough to go along with what our mind is detecting. We have character armoring or refuse to breathe fully or have some strategy for not getting as worked up as it would take for us to encounter the physiological and emotional correlates of that mental knowledge.
That makes sense. Would you say that it's probably the case that maybe from a young age, like you just maybe there's a defense mechanism maybe that like you stored it in your body just but then as you're older you're now seeing, oh, I hold this thing in my throat or my neck, and maybe I didn't have a voice in my family. In terms of the mind body, yeah. How do you see that? Sometimes I've talked about in one of my videos, Ken Wilber's philosopher, the notion of there's the physiosphere, the biosphere, and then the noosphere, and I guess considered like the spiritual sphere. And more materialists would say that where our brain creates consciousness, or but at least according to Wilber, my understanding, the noosphere contains the biosphere and the physiosphere. I just wanted to make that point just in terms of the mind body and where you see that, and in terms of trauma getting localized in the body, but also maybe that, like the other, we understand consciousness, I guess.
There are some interesting philosophical approaches that would lead us to think that these basic flavors of experience are maybe present at every level of our structure. There might be, even in a worm, something that's more like a mind, something that's more like feelings, and something that's more like bodily intelligence. But for human beings, it's pretty convenient to think in terms of us first learning to identify as an organism, as a particular body, right? Seems like infants and animals need to create a self-reflective body image map that separates this body from the other bodies in the environment for self-regulation purposes. There's a lot of ways in which just showing up as a human animal as a separate body is the first system. Then having responses to the interpersonal significance of how that body's interacting with others and dangers and opportunities is like an additional layer or sphere of affect that goes around that. The ability to organize or reflect upon any of that is analogous to the noosphere. We can conceive of it as an additional layer. But there are different ways to map this out. We can think of these things as being parallel to each other, but there are other ways in which certain aspects of them are stacked and nested, like some of the other elements of the integral model.
Okay, that makes sense. Maybe we can change tunes here a bit, because my context of working with my clients is to do with narcissism generally and being on the receiving end of that. And sometimes I actually use everything's like a lens, right? So I've applied dynamic lens to a narcissistic family, almost like the parent or parents being like cult leaders in some sense. You can't question, there's no feedback loop. Sometimes from a young age, there's a lot of control. You can't maybe leave the house, or you like monitor your friends, or even in a romantic situation where they isolate you. There's this notion that cult-like dynamics can happen in any kind of group or even in a dyad with two people. If you have entitlement and you're narcissistic and you think you're better than everyone, you're looking for worshipers, right? But anyway, so some people can analyze the family from that lens, and but also perhaps in their life they've themselves these dynamics, and maybe in a work environment, or maybe they've joined a community or yoga. They start to see this like dynamics in that. But anyway, I guess I just wanted to ask you about that because I did talk about that in one of my videos, and I'm sure Layman's probably really well versed in terms of just the spiritual teachers. And I guess I asked him earlier offline just about distinction between someone who has some realization and touch with the spirit world or has genuine grounding on spirit. I think that can be measured in some sense. But then again, because of certain teachers are different, right? There's usually can be sexual abuse, there can be physical abuse or financial abuse. There can be a lot of ego too with some of these teachers. How do you make that distinction? Maybe you can comment a bit on cult dynamics. You facilitate groups, so I'm sure you could speak about that too.
Let's see if we can probe some of the aspects of it. Cults are interesting, right? In some ways, they're not problematic. They're the basic building blocks out of which cultures emerge. So you could imagine healthy cults, and
Yeah.
then reciprocally, you can imagine unhealthy cultic aspects of anything. Could be business, could be family, could be your romantic relationships, could be the church, whatever it is. All those things can obey the same problematic cult dynamics. Now, problematic dynamics in a developmental system is very interesting to think about because usually those dynamics would be appropriate to a lower level of the system, that they act as regression in a certain sense, right? That there might be a form of human survival anciently or in certain circumstances where the thing we think of as problematic cult behavior would be what those people needed to see and do, believe, and feel in order to survive.
Would you consider
But
like dominant hierarchies, or would you use that word?
you can see in animals a lot of behaviors that for sensitive, complex human beings would amount to a regression to a subhuman level that we don't want to occupy. But they don't have no function. They just have a lower function than the level we are aspiring to stabilize at. When you look at individuals with some degree of realization, you have to be able to contextualize that. If you've never even considered that anybody might have unique state access or development in some regard, or the ability to seemingly transmit certain forms of consciousness and energy, or some kind of amplified existential condition. If you've never considered that and you run into somebody like that whom you are capable of experiencing, there's a tendency to have a kind of psychic inflation that you project onto that person and go, wow, this guy must know everything. I'm going to immediately buy all of his books and surrender to his teachings. It's a natural response, but there has to be a developmental adaptation curve where you figure out how to be a complex human being in that circumstance. It's not as simple as you wake up or partly wake up and now you're perfect. That capacity is situated alongside all the other capacities within that person. They may be really good at certain particular kinds of states, they may be really matured in some ways and really immature or reactive or injured in other aspects of themselves. And they may feel that I'm so good at this, I never even have to look at those parts. I don't have to worry about my interpersonal power dynamics or my sexuality or my eating habits or something. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is the quadrant thing. In integral theory, there's this concern that you always have to keep the subjective and the intersubjective and the systemic and the physical in mind in order to analyze a situation. Very often, you could have a situation where a person is very developed in a lot of ways or open to remarkable aspects of reality that human beings are capable of tuning into. The social setup around them might be really primitive. They might be better than the average society around us. And yet the group dynamics around them might be worse than the average society around us. When we look at people who have these capacities, we have to contextualize that capacity in terms of their other dimensions of being and what the social infrastructure is around them that might be replicating patterns below the level of what this person is trying to express and transmit, is operating with a logic of its own and inviting people into all kinds of problematic and dehumanizing experiences.
I think what you're saying is the teacher can have aspects they're not owning, and then the followers are getting caught up in that issue, or they're not taking ownership. The group around them can have just to say not as developed. There's usually like the teacher, and it made more sense. But obviously, in the modern world, where like in the postmodern world, where everyone's usually more cynical, and there's not like we question hierarchy. I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on that. But sometimes someone like myself, I get a little bit cynical. I just think, well, groupthink, when you get too many people together, it seems to lead to these group dynamics that, like, obviously we all value community. So there's that trade-off. But maybe you can speak a little more about that. Because I think as humans, we're obviously social creatures. But at the same time, we also.
Yeah, I think there's some strategies and requirements that people need going into that circumstance. There's some strategies and requirements we would hope for from the people who are at the center. There's some basic framing that could be useful, right? So there's this question. I've had some exchanges with Andrew Cohen around his concern about keeping a vertical dimension in place and not losing that to a kind of flatland egalitarian, everybody's experience is equally true kind of sensibility, right? And I think both of those exist together in a creative tension that forces us to find integrative or hybrid solutions, right? So it's not necessarily the case that everybody's experience is equal in all regards, and therefore they all get the same voice about what's going on. Nor is it the case that only one person has amazing experience and everybody else is equally at the bottom, unless they submit perfectly, right? You can imagine instead of that flat or pure verticality, a topology, a landscape where different people are at different heights in different regards. So if you're interested in particular states experiences or a particular kind of existential development, it really is true that some people will be further down that path and that you should adapt to them in ways that allow you to gain more of that capacity. And some of that will be just happening through interaction. Some of that will be what they think about the process. Some of that will be about what you think about the process. But that doesn't mean they're the only one. It doesn't mean that they're the highest in every regard, right? Somebody else is a better cook than they are. Connecting to the person who is the best at something is your best option for moving in that direction. It might be that connecting to the person who's one or two steps ahead of you turns out to be much more useful for you to integrate it into your human being. So I
Makes
think
sense.
that's one of the concerns, but it also is important to create a culture in which people who have unique experience are recognized and honored and encouraged to be a little more sensitive, a little more complex, a little more humane, and also to create a culture around people who go, yeah, that happens. I might want to get involved with that. There are protocols for me connecting to those people. There are going to be group dynamics. Some of them will be useful and some of them will be problematic. I have to know about them and anticipate them, treat that as normal. And there might even be therapeutic elements to that. You talked a little bit at the beginning about repetition compulsion. People sometimes seek these things out, or they might go there for a different reason and start to project onto them. Here's a chance for my heart, for my unconscious to replay some of this stuff and see if I can handle it differently. But it only really works if there's a group understanding. That's one of the regular things that's going to happen, and some parameters about what's ethical and humane. We have therapeutic BDSM communities where people enter into hierarchical relations that look very extreme, but there's a whole set of ethical safeguards and consensus based protocols for entering into that relationship. So you could imagine that in the future, there might be a stronger sense of what the consent based ethical protocols for entering into even master disciple relationships would be. And we need to take on board some of our new understandings about what makes that safe and effective.
Makes sense. I think if we're part of a guild or someone has more experience than you, let's say you're a plumber, they just have more years under their belt and can convey that knowledge. But in a spiritual community where it's about consciousness or realization, maybe you can speak more about how you measure that. Sometimes people talk about like you have to know the koan, like you have to have the experience in order to. Sometimes people maybe there's more in their head, more intellectual, and they say, maybe they're more materialistic and don't value the interior world as much. And we're living in a culture where there's a certain quadrant absolutism, and maybe it's more materialistic. It seems like a lot of our culture is very much empirical based and focused on pursuing status or getting things done in the world. I sometimes pull people back to the interior world. Maybe you can speak a little more about the epistemology or how you measure that.
Yeah, the idea of measuring those qualities is, I think, very rudimentary in the system we have right now. I have friends who are trying to advance the neuroimaging capacities to track subtler aspects, not only of state change, but of developmental growth and things. What would it be like? What does the brain look like under conditions that we might call wiser? What's the cognitive science that would define what wisdom even means? There are a lot of people working on this right now. So I think we are getting incrementally closer to having metrics of the objective correlates of some of these conditions. But for now and historically, you basically have to make a social decision, which is how do you feel about this person, about the way they talk, the way they hold themselves, and how do you evaluate what other people say about that person? And I think a lot of that requires us to be pretty stable, complex human beings who can make sensible choices for ourselves and who can experimentally try something out and then evaluate whether it's working for them or not. So there's a tremendous amount of basic human and psycho-emotional healing necessary to produce people who can go, yeah, I really feel like there's something going on in this guy that I want my inside to be more like his, or I want mine to be my version of what I see he's done to himself through his practices. And that it just feels right to me, feels more human, feels more spiritual, feels more transcendental. We all have to make that decision at some point. And the question is, how sane and healthy are we in taking that gamble?
That makes sense. Is there anything more? I guess I was just thinking earlier about teachers and narcissism. Have you come across that? Do you think difficult personalities, how that shows up in the we space? And does, I don't know if you want, you could be in a spiritual community or just in general in life.
It's fascinating because if you use one of these big maps, like the integral map, and you go, that's a whole bunch of different kinds of narcissism that are available. Each type and each level might have their own flavor of narcissism.
Yeah.
Some people are just, we think of them as assholes or as energy vampires. It's debilitating to be around them because they seem completely sealed off from the possibility of anyone else's experience. And they're always pointing everything back to themselves. And sometimes it's aggressive and violent and nasty, and sometimes it's just a sweet little old lady who won't shut up about her grandkids all the time and leaves you feeling like you want to kill yourself, right? So there's that normal level, but then you can get a more sophisticated person who's really aware of sensitivities and projection dynamics, and they don't notice that they're somewhat narcissistic in their response to narcissists, right? They always want to tell you how good they are at detecting narcissists and how they don't tolerate narcissists. You got to sit there and wait for an hour for them to tell the story 5 times about how good they are at criticizing narcissists. But that's a more complex presentation. And then you can get to these interesting things that happen with people, sometimes as freak mutations, but often as a result of long periods of spiritual experience where they've released some of the ordinary human concerns. That gives them a certain indifference to a lot of things they used to be concerned about, afraid of, sensitive to. And the problem there is it might be a very good thing, but it might inhibit their ability to process very sensitive and granular signals coming from other people. This is something I'm concerned about in myself too. You're like, in the degree to which my inner work is successful, I feel happier, more stable, more successful, more expansive, less motivated by a sense of an internal problem that has to be corrected. So if you're already feeling pretty good, what do you care about the quibbles of other people? Right. So then there's a possibility of being indifferent to the well being of others out of a seemingly a very positive experience. And then you have to have other kinds of development or protocols around you, right? Friends, feedback, things that can mitigate your tendency to be absorbed into a potentially wonderful condition that leaves you largely indifferent to other people's results. And then if they say, "Can you help me?" you might do all kinds of things to them thinking you're helping and not pay any attention to their response saying, "That's not helping, it's distressing me."
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, like you're saying, there's subtleties to narcissism just in general. Like some people talk like narcissistic type, like it's maybe a cultural aspect where people are being more narcissistic because I guess it pays to some degree or a way to navigate the world. There are like full NPD where they're really malignant, or there's covert and there's the overt. And then within a spiritual community or yoga, like they can have a lot of knowledge and therapeutic language. And some people talk about therapists sometimes could have like narcissism. And I'm also, because sometimes if you're the scapegoat, right, in a receiving end of a family dynamic, there's usually a lot of self-doubt, right? Because you basically have the family project on you. Let's just say it's a narcissistic father. He says you're selfish, and then you grow up as an adult, and maybe you have these interjects, like this inner dialogue, and you may believe the family still and believe. But I guess so there's always this worry, am I the narcissist? And I think we all have selfish tendencies, and it's always good to question yourself, but you can also doubt yourself, and then you go back in the system and you just go along with the distortions. I guess I'm just wondering how far do you go into analyzing yourself where you can really know that you're being a narcissist. Sometimes it's hard to be objective about yourself, and some of that's feedback from others too.
It
But yeah,
certainly is. Yeah. And the people who need it the most are the least capable of it. And the people who are somewhat capable of it, it can be a problem, but it's not as much of a problem. If somebody says to you, "I'm really worried I might be a sociopath," the answer is usually, who doesn't worry about that is a sociopath. Even though it's actually more complex, there's a gradient and a spectrum of different kinds of sociopathy and things like that. But the person who's been near to examples of narcissism might have some of those traits, but also has a sensitivity to them. And that puts them in a complex position, with the normal position of a healthy human being who's been exposed to that. And they have to find ways to heal that and work through both the bits of narcissism that have been projected into them, the bits of narcissism that might be left over forms of function from their own cognition, because in some ways, every baby is a solipsist, so to speak, right? So one way to look at narcissism is it's a remainder of a lower order adaptation in the system. And insofar as your development was interfered with, or you just didn't get the chance to process all of it, you might have some narcissism of your own that's just a lower level that hasn't been matured. You might have some narcissism that you took on from the other as part of your internalization of their projection. You might have a reciprocal narcissism you generated to protect yourself. In spiritual communities, it can get very elaborately exaggerated, right? Very famously, Adida, a notoriously potent teacher and transmitter. And I know people who spent many years with him and found him to be wise and loving, but also an asshole. His presentation contained this enormous kind of insulated self-referencing when his early teaching was everybody's a narcissist and that's the thing you have to overcome. He viewed narcissism as just the emotional interest in your own experience, that you're always trapped looking at your experience, and that keeps your energy from expanding to its transcendental capacity. And there is something amazing and transformative about that if you encounter it at the right moment of your life and can gauge it intelligently. And there is a way in which we're all narcissists to some degree, but then you have to complexify that and go, maybe there's a minimum form of narcissism that's necessary to have a functional ego, that maybe there's a certain amount of self-concern and a self-protective insulation you need. But the biggest danger in spiritual spaces is this idea that everybody but me is narcissistic. They're sealed into their self-concern, and I have to break them open. That's why they've come to me. My job is to explode their narcissism and make them available to the mega context of the transcendental condition. And that gives me free rein to be an asshole to them, and I think it's for their own good. A lot of that is going to be me projecting my unassimilated stuff onto them. So those dynamics will have to be watched very carefully.
Yeah, because there's a certain elitism, right? Like if you have these state experiences, you sometimes think you're better than people, or you think you see, and you sometimes do see more. But then, and I was also just gonna, because to go back to Ken Wilber, the developmental stages. I think what you're saying is that there could be an aspect of this is just a child part, or this is like a younger regression of the self, or we all start out somewhat egotistical. We go through that also think of developmental stages. So there's a traditional level, right? Maybe it's someone who's tied up with the church and they're very good versus evil, and they have to be this good person and project this image. But then maybe in their house with the kids, they're very cruel and cold. At a modern level, and Wilber talks about winners and losers. I'm a winner and I'm so much better than people, and these are losers. And at a postmodern level, it's cool or not cool. Either you're hip or you're not hip, or like you're conscious or you're not, and you're woke, you're not. And so I'm just curious, it can show up in these developmental stages, would you say, at different levels? Just something
Yeah,
to
I would
watch
say
out
that
for.
once a structure is created within an individual, these pathological functions that are not conducive to higher order adaptation, it can be expressed through whatever capacities and social contexts the person emerges into. If the person becomes rational, they can rationalize it. If a person becomes artistic, they can be artistic about it. If a person's in a church, they can be churchy about it. If they're in the government, they can be governmenty about it. If they're a libertarian, they can do it in a libertarian way. If they're a socialist, they can do it in a socialist way, right? It can express itself in any of those languages once we learn those languages. It's the same underlying structure. But then if you're trying to help someone or trying to avoid being harmed by someone, you might have to adapt to the kinds of languages that they can hear, or be able to, at the very least, tease apart the language from the structure. If you have a good sense of the language and a good sense of the structure, you're in a great position. But if somebody comes to you and they want to talk about new postmodern pluralistic egalitarian consciousness and how we have to change things, it's very hard sometimes to know which of those things actually pertains to the world and which are being used to express some underlying underdeveloped aspect of themselves. Right? We can easily get confused and conflate how they're talking or what they seem to be talking about with the idea that they are completely at the level of the thing they're discussing. Just like a person could speak all kinds of spiritual words and still be at a really low level of development, or could be really traumatized. A person could be modern or postmodern or traditional and be speaking from their trauma or from some lower order structure in themselves.
Would you say where it goes wrong? Like I think about somatic narcissists, like someone who values their body, maybe at the gym, and they think that they're usually like I think the ego, right, attaches itself to any. I think that's kind of what you're saying in some sense. If you're artistic, maybe your ego gets tied up with that, or if you're very intelligent, it's your mind, and you think everyone else is dumb or something. Where does it go wrong with Carl Jung? You might say there's underinflation and overinflation. I guess to some degree you want to have healthy self-esteem and have healthy confidence where you have some humility and you take feedback and you reflect. But usually a narcissist, like they're more an externalizer, they blame, and they don't tend to internalize or like you said, project, or they tend to have all these defense mechanisms. Is there anything else you want to say about that?
I think one of the things I would add is everything in your life contributes to healing or not healing, right? So there's a question of how do you mentioned Jung. Is it too much expansion or too little expansion? Everything in us is complex. My friend John's a cognitive scientist. He always talks about opponent processing, right? The systems are always doing this, trying to negotiate where the sweet spot is to be appropriately in relationship and self regulation. And that's a moving target. So we're always figuring that out. The question is, how good is our system at coming up with the balances and hunches that we could bring to bear on addressing our problems? And that capacity is informed by everything that we do, right? If you're exercising and getting fresh water and good food, right, then your odds of being able to find that balance in yourself go up. It doesn't solve the problem, but every aspect of what you work on in your life frees your energy or compresses your energy to deal with these problems or allow yourself to reorganize and start to heal these things.
Okay. I don't want to keep you too long, but within a narcissistic family, because that's where I specialize, we were talking about dynamics. Within Sam Vaknin, a psychologist, believes that the narcissist creates a shared fantasy. They idolize you, but then can also discard you. In very unhealthy, dysfunctional homes, the parents will sometimes get the kids like mother them or either like a therapist almost for them. So the hierarchy's kind of been reversed. This notion that the narcissist creates this shared fantasy where they are both a mother to you, but also expect you to be a mother to them. I wonder if that shows up in certain teachers and group dynamics and cult systems where there's a shared fantasy, like you were saying earlier, where you like, idolize the teacher, but then they discard their students' abuse cycle, right? Where you tend to love bomb someone, you idolize them, and then you start to discard them, or you devalue them, and you discard them, and then you're on the outs, and then you go back into the system, and repeat the cycle. So that's the notion of the shared fantasy. But you can never really point the truth because if you point the truth, then their false self, like they don't want to admit and they tend to double down. So I don't know if I said too much there, but I guess I'm just curious if that resonates with you about those.
I think there's more productive and less productive versions of those processes. One interesting Zen teacher I know believes in the importance of having students project onto him because he thinks there's a process of working with their unconscious that doesn't begin until the transference begins. Then they can start to get into a difficult and messy process where the teaching infiltrates deeper layers of their being. If that's done with enough awareness and mutual consent, that could be a really interesting process, depending on how good a person is at doing that. I think there's a minimum level to which shared fantasy is used to constitute social relationships in general. Like we do have to think something and pretend something in order to come together to get anything done. There's shared fantasy in getting the kids to the mall. But
Yeah.
there's also a lot of possibility for that to go wrong and to be an interpersonal duplication of narcissistic patterns, whether they exist in the central person or not, right? It could be that person's patterns end up patterning the group, or it could be that person doesn't have that much narcissistic issue going on themselves, but the way the group is laid out and its flavor, it creates a kind of collective narcissistic pattern onto that person. All of these dynamics need to be taken into account. There's no way to avoid them. The best thing is to be like literate about them and to create a situation which everybody can constructively offer different kind of feedback and mutually assess how close or far away from that process they want to be.
Yeah. And I almost think about those extreme communities, right, where it's shut off from the world and they're in this shared fantasy, and then they take the Kool-Aid, right? Like you were saying, when you meet somebody, we're all analyzing each other to a degree. That's part of forming a relationship, and especially when romantically you have your rose-colored glasses on and your feelings are all tied up with that. But then within a narcissistic system, they hijack that and they can use it to manipulate and to like this intermittent reinforcement. So they give you a little bit and then they take away. So it hooks you to this addictive cycle.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's a good way to think about it. People who instinctively get into those transference and addiction cycles with other people, that's a lot of the dynamic you seem to be looking at. And it's especially possible whenever an individual has to deal with a lot of other individuals in a value-laden context, right? So you could be a teacher at the front of the room, you could be wealthy, you could be a celebrity, any kind of thing where your interactions with someone is always framed by the fact that you're going to have a bunch of interactions with a bunch of other people as well. And so you're not necessarily beholden to be fully human with each individual because you're looking across all these different interactions. You can drop that person easily because there's always somebody else there to fill that void. So I think that's one of the dynamics that can create a group scenario that's narcissistic in its structure, is just the sense that the individuals aren't fully individual. They're an expendable resource for the person at the center of the process. But I think what that does is basically duplicate what the narcissist develops an instinct for, which is puffing themselves up by puffing the other person up and then taking it away. There's like an implicit negging process that goes on there. For you're addicted to keeping the other person addicted to the shared fantasy, but you want them to have enough of it to stay addicted, but not so
Yeah.
much that they feel secure about it.
I don't know if you watched that P. Diddy documentary, or I don't know, that's kind of like a complete aside, but it just seemed like he was playing with that in some sense, or the community around him was too. But yeah, I don't want to be too long, but maybe if people want to check your workout or your book, maybe you can just say a little more about where they can find you.
Sure. Probably the simplest thing is laymanpascal.com or laymanpascal.substack.com, where I do my main writings. Otherwise, there's the Integral Stage podcast. There's lots of other podcasts. You can find me around a lot of places, but those are some of the most reliable ones.
Great. Appreciate you taking the time today, and I'm sure people will really benefit from this.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been great talking with you. These are really juicy, interesting topics that are at that curious intersection between developmentalism, spiritualism, and healing. So it's very exciting. I think these are great topics. And I think they're topics which, as much as there's a popular discourse around things like narcissism and family dynamics, we really don't know a lot about it yet. I'm just at the beginning of figuring this stuff out.